The roar of war echoed through the Italian hills. It was April 1944, and the ruins of Monte Cassino still smoldered from the latest Allied bombing. Amid the haze, a pair of American P-40 Warhawks swept the sky, assigned to cover what was left of the bomber formation limping home. The mission was supposed to be routine, brief, uneventful, but war rarely follows a schedule. From the northeast, two black dots streaked toward the formation. BF 109 seconds. Fast, surgical, ruthless. Their approach was textbook high altitude, sun at their backs, descending in staggered attack paths. The P-40 seconds turned to intercept, one immediately pulling into a climb. The second Warhawk smoke trailing faintly from its fuselage lagged behind, its pilot fighting for control. He should have been dead in less than a minute. Instead, what followed confounded every law of aerial engagement. As the BF 109 seconds closed in, the wounded P-40 didn't climb, dive, or roll with grace. It lurched. It twisted violently to the left, then suddenly pitched upward at an erratic angle. The movement defied coordination. It looked almost like mechanical failure, but it wasn't. The first BF 109 overshot its target entirely, missing the P-40 by 50 yards. The second tried to adjust, aligning for a high-speed pass, but again, the American fighter jolted left mid-burst, the cannon fire slicing empty sky. Over the next 6 minutes, the German pilots tried every trick. Side approach, vertical drop, pincer. Nothing worked. The P-40 moved unpredictably enough to survive. When fuel finally ran low, the Germans peeled away, frustrated and empty-handed. The P-40, battered but unbroken, limped back to base. Ground crews ran to meet the pilot, expecting to find a shredded control surface, a cracked fuselage, maybe even jammed hydraulics. What they found instead froze them in place. The left wing was bent, upward, not crushed, not warped, repaired with a visible, uneven 2.3-degree rise. Welded seams from an old trainer wing. Alignment slightly off, balance slightly skewed. Flight-worthy, but not regulation. Technically, that P-40 shouldn't have flown at all. And yet, not only had it flown, it had survived an engagement it was never meant to win. The pilot was stunned. The officers confused. But one man wasn't. A soft-spoken mechanic named Joe Sanders leaned quietly against the hangar door, arms crossed, watching everyone puzzle over what he'd done. The brass called it lucky. Joe knew better. It wasn't luck. It was chaos, captured and shaped. An accident born from necessity. A mistake that turned into an advantage. And that day, high above Cassino, one bent wing did something no symmetrical fighter could. It moved like it didn't care about dying. And that made all the difference. Since the dawn of powered flight, one principle reigned supreme: symmetry. From the Wright brothers' flyers to the latest fighters of 1944. Every blueprint, every manual, every training module drilled the same gospel into pilots and engineers alike. Balance equals control, and control equals survival. A fighter jet, or even a propeller-driven warbird, had to be a mirror of itself across its central axis. Deviations weren't just frowned upon, they were lethal. In the U.S. Army Air Forces, any deviation from symmetrical alignment during repairs was considered a catastrophic risk. A 1-degree twist in a wing could throw off lift. A crooked control surface might induce flutter or spin. The manuals were unforgiving. A damaged wing had to be replaced in full. No exceptions. If that wasn't possible, the aircraft was grounded. But by 1944, the war had moved faster than logistics. Combat attrition was outpacing factory output. In Italy, where mountains shredded rail lines and mud swallowed convoys, frontline mechanics didn't have pristine parts or time. They had salvaged metal, bent spars, torch welders, and field tents. And they had to make it work. Joe Sanders was one of those mechanics. Stationed with the 325th Fighter Group, he was known for one thing: never letting a fighter stay grounded for long. He didn't wait for the right wing to arrive. He made a wing. Sometimes it came from a wrecked trainer, sometimes from a recon bird. If the measurements were close enough, Sanders said, the air would forgive the rest, but the doctrine didn't agree. Every field fix he did walked a line between genius and court-martial. Still, the math told a different story. The planes Sanders mismatched weren't falling from the sky, they were coming back more often than the factory-fresh ones. That's when the myth of symmetry began to fracture. Flight is not perfection. It's physics. It's energy and compromise and timing. A perfectly symmetrical fighter is easier to control, but also easier to predict. It turns the same way, bleeds speed the same way, and stalls on cue. A slightly asymmetrical aircraft, if flown well, becomes a wild card. Unstable, yes, but in a dogfight, unpredictability could be the most powerful weapon of all. The Luftwaffe wasn't used to targets that didn't behave by the book. Their intercept formations were based on symmetrical patterns. 2 fighters flanking, 1 above, 1 diving. When those tactics failed against Sanders' broken P-40 seconds, they didn't know how to adapt. The rule was, fix it perfectly, or don't fly at all. But in Italy's muddy airfields, Joe Sanders quietly wrote a new one. If it flies crooked but it flies, you send it back up. By 1944, the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk was a paradox in the sky, ubiquitous, reliable, and outdated all at once. Once hailed as America's first true fighter of the war, it had become a workhorse relegated to secondary theaters, while newer designs like the P-51 Mustang and P-47 Thunderbolt dominated headlines. But the P-40 still flew, especially in the Mediterranean, North Africa, and Pacific places where terrain, weather, and chaos punished newer, more delicate aircraft. The P-40's design was brutally simple. All metal, single engine, inline V12 Allison or Merlin engine, and an airframe optimized for ruggedness over agility. It lacked high-altitude performance, struggled in vertical climbs, and its top speed, roughly 360 miles per hour, was easily outpaced by most German and Japanese fighters by 1943. The Germans called it das Plumpflugzeug, the clumsy plane. Pilots flying it in 1944 often complained about 3 things: poor acceleration, weak climb rate, and heavy controls at high speeds. In a vertical fight, the Warhawk was toast. Against FOV 190 seconds or Me 109 seconds, it had to rely on diving away or tight-turn dogfights at lower altitudes to survive. It wasn't a star, it was a survivor. But what the P-40 lacked in flair, it made up for in toughness. Its airframe could take punishment and still limp home. Its landing gear was sturdy, and it could be maintained in the field with minimal tools. That's why, despite its reputation as second-rate, it stuck around far longer than expected. Still, by early 1944, most P-40 seconds were on borrowed time. The Mustang was faster, longer-ranged, and more versatile. The Thunderbolt was deadlier and tougher. Yet, in the Italian theater, many squadrons were still flying Warhawks because they were what was available and, more importantly, what could still be kept flying after weeks of hard use on crumbling frontline airstrips. Enter Joe Sanders. Sanders understood something most engineers didn't. When machines age, they stop behaving like machines and start behaving like personalities. No 2 old fighters flew the same. Bent spars, loosened bolts, warped skins, all these accumulated over hundreds of hours. And instead of fighting that drift, Sanders leaned into it. When a P-40 returned with a wingtip sheared off by flak, he didn't demand a replacement from Naples. He scavenged parts from a downed trainer. When a pilot reported odd rudder feel, Sanders didn't recenter the tail. He adjusted it to match the leftward torque the engine naturally built up over hours of flight. His fixes were wrong on paper. But the planes kept flying. And more importantly, they kept returning. The Warhawk, slow and heavy, was supposed to be a liability by 1944. But under the care of a mechanic willing to break rules, it became something new, a patchwork predator that moved like a ghost in the hands of the right pilot. Because if the enemy thinks they understand how your plane flies, and they're wrong, you win. Military aviation runs on metrics. From sortie rates to engine hours, kill ratios to maintenance time, everything is logged, charted, compared. And when the numbers change dramatically, when reality drifts from prediction, command notices. Sometimes it's a fluke. Sometimes it's a clue. In early April 1944, Allied Command noticed something odd in mission reports from the 325th Fighter Group. P-40 units operating out of southern Italy were returning from Luftwaffe encounters with an unusually high success rate far above the expected loss ratio. Prior to this, the average engagement survival rate for P-40 seconds facing German interceptors hovered around 48%. It was grim math. The Luftwaffe had better aircraft and, in many cases, better pilots. But that month, one squadron's survival rate jumped to 91%. At first it seemed like a statistical blip, then the pattern repeated. Over a 12-day period, the same squadron went up 6 times. 5 encounters with enemy aircraft. No losses. No confirmed kills either, but every plane returned. That was unheard of. Command reviewed gun camera footage. The few that had it showed chaos. German fighters overshooting their targets. Break turns that made no tactical sense. And one report mentioned something strange. German cannon fire consistently missed behind the P-40 seconds, even at close range. Something was off. Engineers were sent to inspect the planes. That's when they found the discrepancies. 4 of the aircraft had subtle but measurable structural misalignments. 2 had left wings bent upward between 1.8 degrees and 2.4 degrees. 1 had a horizontal stabilizer 3 millimeters off-center. Another had asymmetric ailerons, with one travel range significantly higher than spec. These weren't factory errors. They were field repairs. Unrecorded. Improvised. Further analysis revealed the root cause. Missing parts, salvaged spares, and one key decision: these planes had been worked on by Joe Sanders. His unconventional, close-enough fixes had altered flight characteristics in ways no engineer had intended. But instead of killing the aircraft, it had turned them into anomalies, unpredictable, evasive, even hard to aim at. The uneven lift from a bent wing introduced subtle roll-yaw coupling. The offset stabilizer gave just enough instability to disrupt enemy firing solutions during a chase. The asymmetrical ailerons, they made standard barrel rolls whip into chaotic spirals, dangerous to attempt, deadly to follow. The Luftwaffe didn't know how to respond. Pilots began logging strange entries in their debriefings. Target unstable. Could not predict path. Evaded unnaturally. By the time command understood what Sanders had done, the genie was out of the bottle. The planes were flying. The stats were climbing. The rules no longer mattered. In the world of engineering, symmetry was law. But in the mathematics of survival, asymmetry had found its weapon. The 4th of May, 1944. The Tyrrhenian coast, near Piombino, shimmered in the late afternoon sun. A 4-ship formation of P-40 seconds from the 325th Fighter Group had been tasked with a recon sweep and light escort duty for a group of photo reconnaissance aircraft returning from central Italy. The skies were quiet, too quiet. Then, out of the thin Mediterranean haze, they came. 3 Me, 109 seconds, diving in a classic staggered formation. The P-40 seconds immediately scattered into defensive breaks. 2 of them peeled left to draw fire. The lead P-40 and its wingman dove toward the sea. What the Germans didn't know was that the lead aircraft serial, 2045, was the same bent-wing Warhawk Joe Sanders had repaired 3 weeks earlier. Its pilot, Lieutenant Bill Granger, had flown 28 combat missions without a kill. He was cautious, methodical. But today, the sky would force his hand. One Me-109 locked onto his 6. The German dove fast, firing a long-range burst that skimmed past Granger's canopy. He yanked the stick hard left, expecting the usual bank, but the plane jerked violently. The asymmetric wing bent the air differently now. Instead of a smooth roll, the P-40 dipped, skidded mid-turn, then pitched up in a snap. The Me-109's shot missed by feet, the pilot overcorrecting in surprise. Granger didn't fight the motion. He followed the chaos, pulling into a spiraling climb that looked unstable, even dangerous. The German couldn't keep up. By the third spiral, Granger found himself behind his attacker. He fired. A short burst. Impact. The Me-109 rolled into a nosedive and vanished beneath the clouds. Radio chatter erupted. The other Me-109 seconds shifted targets, but they were already too late. One was tangled in a chase with a P-40 that suddenly pulled into an erratic vertical scissor, the kind of maneuver that would normally stall a Warhawk. But this wasn't a normal plane. Its bent wing gave it just enough lift on one side to ride the edge of stall, bucking, yawing, refusing to follow a clean curve. The German missed again. 2 seconds later, the P-40 ducked under, banked violently, and vanished. The mission ended with 0 Allied losses. 2 Me-109 seconds were confirmed downed. The recon planes made it back intact. Granger landed last, stepping onto the tarmac, stunned. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like he'd wrestled a tornado and somehow come out on top. The debriefing team asked him how he'd turned the tables on a superior aircraft. He shrugged. "It wasn't me," he said. "It was the way the plane moved. Like it was fighting back on its own." The mechanics knew what he meant. That plane had quirks. Sanders' wing had changed how it behaved in every axis. It rolled differently. It climbed unevenly. And that asymmetry, instead of being a flaw, had become its weapon. What looked like instability was actually unpredictability. What looked like danger was survival. The Luftwaffe never figured out why some P-40 seconds seemed untouchable. But Joe Sanders and Bill Granger knew. The sky, it turns out, had no loyalty to the rulebook, and neither did they. The U.S. Army Air Forces didn't plan for asymmetric engineering. It wasn't in the manuals, the schematics, or the doctrine. But after the Piombino incident, commanders couldn't ignore what they were seeing. Over the next 6 weeks, 4 squadrons reported P-40 seconds surviving encounters they statistically shouldn't have. When analysts compared those airframes to standard models, the pattern was clear. Planes with slight asymmetries, wing bends, offset stabilizers, uneven lift profiles had lower loss rates and higher return rates, especially during surprise engagements or tail chases. They weren't outgunning the enemy. They were simply becoming harder to hit. Joe Sanders had stumbled into something that upset the combat equation. Traditionally, the kill chain worked like this: spot, track, close, fire, confirm. That sequence depended on predictability. A symmetric aircraft flew on rails. Enemy gunners, trained on thousands of flight profiles, could anticipate movement with a half-second margin, but a P-40 with a 2.3 degrees upward bend in its left wing didn't fly on rails. It wobbled in pitch, rolled into climbs faster on one side, and yawed slightly on turns. These quirks didn't make it better, they made it unreadable. Every Luftwaffe pilot used to hunting Mustangs and Thunderbolts suddenly found himself chasing a plane that refused to behave. That wasn't supposed to happen. Even worse for the Germans, the illusion wasn't obvious. On the outside, these Warhawks looked normal. The asymmetry was subtle, barely visible unless you measured it. But in motion, it was chaos. Gunfire would consistently overshoot. Strafing runs failed to connect. In a dozen after-action reports, Luftwaffe pilots logged the same complaint. Target evasive. Unstable movement. Could not align. It was the math of collapse, not of machines breaking, but of assumptions unraveling. The U.S. command didn't officially sanction asymmetric repairs. Doing so would have violated every airworthiness regulation. But off the record, Field commanders gave their best mechanics more leeway. And suddenly, maintenance crews weren't just fixing planes, they were quietly experimenting. A whole new micro-doctrine emerged: controlled imperfection. Instead of grounding a plane for wing misalignment, mechanics measured it, documented how it flew, and handed it to pilots who could handle the unpredictability. In some units, pilots requested specific planes not for power or speed, but for their strangeness in the air. The enemy adapted slowly, too slowly. For a brief window, Allied squadrons held a bizarre advantage. The Germans couldn't fight what they couldn't model. And so, from the ruins of regulation, a new truth emerged: perfection was overrated. Survival favored the wild. The 22nd of June, 1944. Over the skies of Naples, Allied bombing runs were in full swing. The target, Axis fuel depots, and anti-aircraft positions near the harbor, while B-26 bombers pounded the shoreline. P-40 escorts carved wide circles above, scanning for enemy interceptors. Among them flew Lieutenant James "Brick" Dorsey, in a P-40 nicknamed Crooked Halo, a name earned not from religion, but from the bent rudder that pulled the aircraft slightly right in level flight. That rudder had been fixed in a rush by Joe Sanders himself using salvaged control cables and a spliced vertical stabilizer from a recon bird. Most pilots would have written it off as dangerous. Dorsey didn't care. He flew what he was given, and soon discovered Crooked Halo didn't fly wrong. It flew weird, like it had a mind of its own. That weirdness would save his life and 7 bombers within 14 minutes. As the squadron reformed post-bomb drop, radar crackled with reports, multiple contacts approaching from the north at high altitude. It was the 10 JG-77, one of the Luftwaffe's elite units, flying Me-109 G-10 seconds. Fast, agile, deadly in climbs. The Germans pounced. Dorsey's squadron split instantly, diving to draw them away from the bomber formation. Within seconds, 2 Me-109 seconds were on Dorsey's tail. He kicked the P-40 into a climbing right turn, then felt the plane resist. The bent rudder pulled him deeper into the roll than expected, but instead of fighting it, he held the pressure. The Warhawk snapped into an odd, off-axis loop that pitched up and sideways at the same time. The 109 seconds followed and overshot. Dorsey rolled out inverted, yanked the nose down, and fired. 1 Me-109 caught 3 rounds in the left wing and veered out of control. The other pulled away but couldn't reacquire. Crooked Halo didn't fly like anything they'd trained against. Its loop angle was off. Its turn radius shifted mid-circle. Even the climb vector drifted unexpectedly. German tactics, built around symmetric pursuit, fell apart. Meanwhile, the rest of the squadron took advantage of the confusion. Using Dorsey's bizarre maneuver as cover, 2 other Warhawks flanked the Me-109 seconds and opened fire. In under 4 minutes, the Germans retreated. The bombers were untouched. No Allied losses. 2 enemy fighters downed. Back at base, Dorsey stepped out of his P-40 to applause from the ground crew. He looked at the plane and smirked. "It flew like a busted lawnmower," he said, "but it danced like a boxer." The debriefing team asked how he managed the evasion. Dorsey shrugged. "Didn't manage it, rode it." In the official report, there was no mention of the rudder modification, no analysis of the flight path. Just a note in the margin: pilot used unconventional maneuvering to break contact. But the crew knew the truth. The Luftwaffe got caught in a trap built from a mistake and flown like a miracle. The Luftwaffe got caught in Frums. The 12th of July, 1944. The Allies had been locked in brutal combat at Monte Cassino for months. While the ground war raged through the rubble of the ancient abbey, the skies above were no less violent. German fighter sweeps tried daily to hammer Allied supply lines and disrupt the constant flow of troops and materiel pushing north. The 325th Fighter Group flying aging P-40 seconds was tasked with shielding these convoys from above. On this day, clouds hung low over the ridge. The sun had not yet burned off the early morning mist. Flying high cover was Captain Ellis Duke Marlin in a P-40 that had survived more flak hits than anyone could count. One hit had bent the right wing spar slightly too minor for replacement, too dangerous to ignore. Sanders had patched it, reinforced it, and most critically, left the bend. Marlin had noticed something peculiar in his last few flights. In climbs, his Warhawk pulled slightly right and pitched up unexpectedly. Turns became tight corkscrews. Vertical loops weren't smooth, they wobbled, twitched, and snapped. But oddly, it gave him speed and unpredictability, especially when flipping from climb to dive. At 0716 hours, radio chatter exploded. "Bandits, north, 4 o'clock high." 3 Me 109 seconds were diving through the cloud bank, sunlight flashing off their canopies. The other Warhawks scattered, but Marlin stayed high. He rolled inverted, punched throttle, and dove straight toward the lead German. The Me 109 pilot banked to evade, assuming Marlin would overshoot. But this P-40 didn't fly by the rules. As he closed, the wing bend tugged his aircraft sideways just enough to keep the nose tracking. The German couldn't escape the aim line. Marlin fired. 3 .50 caliber rounds tore through the 109's fuselage. It erupted in smoke and spiraled out. But now Marlin was exposed. The other 2 German fighters circled and came for him, one above, one below. He rolled left, pulled into a steep climb, and the plane twisted. That's how he described it later. Not a roll, not a loop, but a twist. The asymmetric wing compressed air unevenly. The climb snapped vertical, then kicked sideways. The Me 109 seconds tried to follow, but the P-40 vanished into the mist. Moments later, Marlin burst from the clouds 500 feet above them. He reversed course, dropped in behind the trailing 109, and opened fire. Second kill. The last German peeled off and ran. Back at base, Marlin sat alone with Sanders, beside the battered P-40. "You left it bent on purpose, didn't you?" he asked. Sanders lit a cigarette. "I didn't have a matching part, so I made the whole plane match the bend." Marlin laughed. "Well, whatever you did, it flies like a damn hallucination." That day, the Monte Cassino supply line was spared an air attack. Thanks not to a new plane or secret weapon, but to a flaw no blueprint would approve. A flaw that bent the laws of air combat, just enough to break the enemy's expectations. By the time Allied forces crossed into northern Italy, the Luftwaffe was exhausted. Resources were drying up, fuel was scarce, and ace pilots were being lost faster than they could be replaced. But one quiet advantage the Allies had developed wasn't written in tactical manuals or designed in secret labs. It was born in the backs of dusty hangars, under pressure, under fire, hammered into shape by grease-stained hands like Joe Sanders. The bent wing fix never became official doctrine. The U.S. Army Air Forces never issued memos endorsing structural asymmetry. But in field after field, mechanics knew what worked. When a pilot returned from a mission and said, "This one moves different, but it moves right," the crew made notes. When a dogfight was won not with firepower but with flight behavior no one could anticipate, they took the hint. Unintended quirks became tactical tools. In the end, it was the junkyard edge that made some fighters uncatchable. Not because they were faster, or stronger, or newer, but because they were irregular, unpredictable, beautifully broken in just the right way. Symmetry meant control. Asymmetry meant chaos. And chaos was hard to shoot down. The Luftwaffe never developed a countermeasure for Sanders' modifications. They couldn't. The advantage changed from aircraft to aircraft, from one field repair to another. There was no profile to study, no pattern to predict. The best they could do was brace for the unexpected, and that, in war, is a death sentence. Looking back, pilots who flew those imperfect planes rarely saw themselves as innovators. They just adapted. They trusted their crews. And sometimes, they trusted the plane more than they trusted doctrine. The Mustang, the Warhawk, the Thunderbolt, they were never designed for chaos. But they flew it. And sometimes, they mastered it. On the wall of Joe Sanders' post-war garage hung a single artifact, a warped aluminum wingtip with 4 bullet holes punched through it. When asked why he kept it, he simply said, "It was the one that came back." There's poetry in that. The Allied war machine was massive, efficient, and relentless. But buried in the gears were outliers, humans and machines that broke form, bent rules, and made survival an art form. They weren't perfect, but they were impossible to predict. And in aerial warfare, that was the deadliest trait of all. The next time you see an old warbird in a museum, glossy, pristine, resting on polished wheels, remember, that's not how they flew. The real killers were bent, dented, repaired with mismatched parts. They carried the weight of every hack, every field fix, every ounce of desperation hammered into steel by men like Joe Sanders. They didn't win by perfection. They won by unpredictability. This story wasn't about a faster engine. It wasn't about more firepower or a better design. It was about one mechanic who trusted his gut, bent a rule, and in doing so, bent physics just enough to break an enemy's grip on the sky. A bent wing, a twisted stabilizer, a crooked flight path. From these came the chaos that saved lives, that protected bombers, that made Luftwaffe aces miss their shots. That's not a myth. That's air war math. So if this story made you rethink what broken really means in combat hit like, if it made you see World War II fighters not as relics, but as living machines built under fire, drop a comment. And if you want more stories of underdog brilliance, battlefield hacks, and the men who rewrote combat without permission, subscribe now. Because the war wasn't won by following the blueprint, it was won by bending it just enough to fly.